Are you getting dizzy with all the new champions and new item combinations that you could have in set 9.5 Horizon Unbound? Well, here are my recommendations for the carry, support, and situational items of every champion that's new to the set. And remember, this is PB's first impressions. Things could potentially change if Riot reworks the champions or the items itself. All right, let's start off with one costs. There are 3 new one costs in 9.5 around Graves, Illaoi, and Milio. Graves and Illaoi both are Bilgewater units, so you can actually reroll them in tandem if you end up playing around Bilgewater trait, or you can just play them separately based off their other traits, like Graves is a gunner and a rogue, and Illaoi is a bastion. If you do end up rerolling Graves, one of the most impressive items that I found is Steric Gauge. This is an item that gives him not just HP and attack damage, but ends up triggering really nicely in tandem with Rogue. This is because it ends up giving Graves a little bit of extra HP and attack damage right before he teleports at 50% HP and goes to the back line. And so based off the timing of it, Graves ends up getting a big burst of potential damage, and that way he can take care of backline units. If you do want additional items for Graves, you can go for BT and Titans. This is also the type of traditional bruiser itemization, so instead of Bloodthirster, you can go for Hand of Justice, or even just more damage items straight up, like, Infinity Edge, Giant Slayer, Last Whisper, so on and so forth. In terms of the support Graves version, if you want to put random items on Graves that can be really good, either as an item holder or to assist your other carries, you can put all the anti-heal items on him. He's actually a good holder of Sunfire Cape because it's a 1 hex radius champion. And then also you have Morellonomicon, which off the smoke grenade actually leaves kind of a nice way to burn a bunch of different champions. The other item that's actually quite good on Graves as well is the Even Shroud. This is like the Ionic Spark version of armor shredding or sundering. So Even Shroud is the opposite of Ionic Spark, where if you want to get past a bunch of armor on champions, you just slam this on Graves. And it's kind of nice because when he teleports to the back with the Rogue, you end up assassinating the backline that much quicker. I break things down to 3 categories: carry, support, and situational items. In terms of the situational items for Graves, he can hold a bunch of different items, but it's actually pretty common for him to hold something like Thief's Gloves because you want to give him items if he's part of like your rogue or your gunner setup. You don't want to actually invest a lot of resources. Plus, he can use a bunch of defensive, offensive items, so Thief's Gloves ends up being pretty nice. Another item that I think has been surprisingly interesting is Trickster's Glass because of the amount of utility that you get from Graves, which can be pretty nice early on before you eventually get to Trickster's Glass on a better champion. And then Juggernaut Emblem ends up being quite good for Graves because it links into Bilgewater Juggernaut off of Nautilus, who we'll talk about later, and an opportunity for Graves to turn into a miniature off tank. Because Graves is triple traded, you could really have a lot of flexibility if you want to give him that Bilgewater Gunner and Rogue. So remember that if you don't have Rogue activated, he can be that utility off tank. For Illaoi, you want to actually prioritize just traditional Bastion support items like Sunfire Cape and Redemption. The Sunfire Cape is really good because it helps burn through a lot of the front line, and Illaoi lives a long time through the Bastion resistances. And Redemption is the same way because it heals their missing HP, which ends up synergizing really well with the Bastion resistance. Ionic Spark ends up being pretty good because of the shred, and that synergizes with Illaoi's magic damage. This also means that if you end up playing Illaoi and you want to have a lot of AD in your comp, you can also put Even Shroud onto her as well. Support Illaoi actually utilizes a lot of the support items very well. The one, for example, I want to shout out is Aegis of the Legion. Because Illaoi can be a really nice solo frontliner in the early game, you can give her Aegis and then end up buffing the units behind her. He's also a really good user of things like Shroud as well. Virtue of the Martyr also ends up being quite a solid item on Illaoi if you let her die pretty early, so that way the healing increases on all your other Bastion units or whatever you're playing. The other situational items are things like the Ornn, which Illaoi could theoretically hold because she is an early cheap frontliner, so you can give her things like Eternal Winter, Anima Visage, and Hull Crusher. These are the standard defensive Ornn items. Milio is a 1-star Invoker carry that ends up piercing through with a fire kick, shoots a ball, and it ends up going to whoever is behind the target as well. This means that Milio actually gets a lot of value off of things like Guardbreaker despite being kind of single target because it ends up hitting a shielded unit and then hitting the backline unit right afterwards. So the bonus damage you get from Guardbreaker is really good on top of the raw AP that you get from Death Cap, and Guardbreaker ends up being good for the Invoker comps because you end up healing that frontline a lot. This also means that any kind of source of AP could be pretty good on Milio, so if you get Archangel Staff or other ways to get ability power, it ends up being quite solid on Milio. In terms of the support items on Milio, you can go for things like Chalice, which is generically pretty solid for the AP, and remember, Invokers really want a lot of AP because it gets so much mana. And then other things like Shiv, for example, could be pretty good because it adds a lot of support DPS from behind, and Milio is like a cheap Invoker to be able to hold that early game. If you do end up playing around a bunch of Ornn artifacts, Tiger's Focus ends up being pretty good on Milio because it pierces through and it hits the unit behind, which ends up giving a lot of hex radius distance. Deathfire Grasp, so you can nuke past the tanks. And Gold Master Staff ends up being one of Milio's best items early game because Milio should be able to kill a bunch of units and get that gold rolling. Milio really likes playing around the vertical invokers and maybe getting a little bit of Ixtal bonuses as well, depending on whatever the elemental hex is. For 2 costs, we have Qiyana, Naafiri and Twisted Fate. Let's start off with Qiyana, the Ixtal Rogue Slayer. Qiyana is a triple trade champion, so she ends up being quite versatile as a secondary support utility unit, as well as a little bit of DPS if you need her. Her ability strikes through champions in a line and ends up dealing a lot of physical damage. The most important thing about Qiyana is the fact that she stuns and knocks up the first target hit, so she has a little bit of synergy with units like Talia, for example, which knocks up the first target. And so with Set and Qiyana and Talia, maybe you have an opportunity to go for that as part of a reroll composition. Qiyana is a rogue and a slayer, so Hand of Justice ends up being quite good, similar to how it was good on Katarina or Gwen or other similar units in the past. Derek's Gauge is also impressive for the same reason as it was on Graves, because it's a rogue that gets to the back line, activates, Qiyana goes to the back line and potentially snipes a unit. If you want to go for just max DPS, you could go for something like Infinity Edge, although there's a handful of items that you could also justify, even a second Hodge if you want. Another item that I want people to keep an eye on is Night Harvester. This is a new item that replaces Shroud of Stillness, and it gives you a lot of AD and AP stats if you drop below 60% HP, which ends up comboing really well with something like Gauge and the rogue dash to the back line, so that way you can burst. Think of it like Giant Slayer, but the condition instead of having high HP is that it drops below 60% HP, which is really good for those melee champions that get within damage range. Support Qiyana is actually the same as Graves in terms of holding a lot of utility items like anti-heal or aura stuff. Aura items could be things like Zeke's, which is really good because you line up all your rogues in the front line. Locket, Banshee's Veil. There's a handful of aura items that ends up being really good as a support for Qiyana. Qiyana's also quite flexible with her itemization because she can be used defensively or for utility as well as damage. So you can give her either the Thief's Gloves, whether it's regular TG or Orange Blacksmith's Gloves. And then the other shout I want to give is Noxus Emblem, because Qiyana actually combos really well, in particular with Katarina. You can get that early rogue goes to the back line, and Qiyana gets nice utility stun as well as sniping units. If you get Noxus Emblem, for example, early, you can go for Milio, Katarina, Qiyana, Cassio, plus any generic Noxus like Swain. Naafiri actually isn't really itemized very often because he's more of a support champion, but he can actually deal some damage if you end up going for Naafiri reroll. Naafiri ends up being kind of an interesting champion to reroll. You're not really trying to chase 3-star very often because Naafiri's power is mainly through the death, and then the Darkened Dagger gives somebody an extra damage every time they cast. But if you do end up choosing to go for Naafiri, the passive Omnivamp is actually pretty nice if you're able to get a lot of AP onto Naafiri. So if slots in pretty well into those Shurima or Challenger boards, of course, if you get an opportunity to pair Naafiri with Aatrox, that's usually where the money is. There's Gauge also really good on Naafiri for the same reasons as before, which is because he gets into melee range, he ends up dropping a lot of HP. And then you give him BT Titans, just like a standard fighter, which is really good with that AD. For support Naafiri, I want to give a shout out to things like Zizirah Portal, because he wants to taunt and die. Therefore, when people target Naafiri, he gives a darkened buff to an ally, and then it summons a void spawn. And you can also give Virtue of the Martyr, because when Naafiri dies, he ends up healing increased to 14% and continues for 10 seconds. It's a pretty nice buff if you end up timing it correctly. I haven't got a chance to try it out myself, but people insist that Trickster's Glass can be pretty solid on Naafiri, especially early game. You're trying to find a way to ladder up to really powerful units like Scion. Naafiri scales off of both AD and AP in a couple of different unique ways, so you can go ahead and put Thieves Gloves on him if you really need. Naafiri ends up being a pretty good holder of a bunch of global emblems that doesn't really matter who you have it on. So if you have like Strategist Emblem or Targon or Freljord, like units, it doesn't really matter if they hold it because it affects the whole team. You can give it to Naafiri. Twisted Fate is the only actual 2-cost that you probably want to carry often, because Qiyana and Naafiri are more support and utility champions. Twisted Fate is the new multicaster that replaces Teemo and basically wants similar items to Teemo. Give him a blue buff, give him Death Cap, as well as a Gunblade, and just give him a lot of stats for him to deal damage and heal that front line. If you do end up playing Twisted Fate, it's less about Bilgewater and it's more about multicaster, so you end up wanting to go for multicaster with Sona, Vel'Koz, and Talia. And then because you're playing those units, you want to play the front line accordingly, like any Void or Demacia that can end up supporting your front line. Twisted Fate also does really well with a lot of the bonus damage, whether it's Giant Slayer, Guard Breaker. If you don't have blue buff, you can go for different alternative tier items. You can go, for example, Spear of Shojin, or you could try Adaptive Helm, which is starting to become more and more popular as a substitute mana source in case you don't have the ability to get blue buff. It's important to remember that Adaptive Helm is more of a hybrid item because you get a little bit of AP and you get a little bit of mana mana every few seconds. So it's not quite actually a full-on replacement for things like blue buff. The power of Adaptive Helm in this kind of spot is you put it on Twisted Fate, you recognize that you're getting too many offensive items because you get more tears, more rods, more swords, more bows. So you end up selling and replacing Twisted Fate, put Adaptive Helm on a frontliner instead, and then go for, you know, blue buff Shojin on somebody else. Similar to Milio, Twisted Fate has the support items that are just good for AP, like you could put Chalice on him and Shiv. You could also put other things like Zeke's or even a Zephyr if you end up hitting it, because Twisted Fate can go into the corner. In fact, that actually reminds me, Naafiri is actually a great holder of Zephyr as well, because while you do want him to die, you can also put him in the back line and have him time when he actually goes to the front line instead. Situational items, you can go for Deathfire Grasp on Twisted Fate, which is really powerful AP burst. Goldmancer Staff is actually really good on Twisted Fate. You can get him rolling early and rack up that gold. And Twisted Fate ends up being a pretty good sorcerer emblem target because he's a multicaster, so giving him that raw AP lets him scale that ability and deal a ton of damage. Misfortune's best item is blue buff because she only has 50 mana for her cast, and with blue buff reducing down to 40, she ends up casting quite often. Also, keep in mind that Misfortune's ability destroys 30% of the target shields, which is really good against those invokers and shield compositions, and also reducing future incoming shields by 35%, which is really, really nice. And so it's not a surprise that Guard Breaker is also really, really good on her as well. I see a ton of people building Jewel Gauntlet because she gets a lot of AP since she's a strategist, and therefore you don't need as much AP on her. But you can still benefit a ton from just having things like flat AP or other forms of bonus damage, like Giant Slayer, for example. If you have a bunch of AP sources already, let's say you're playing Magic Wand and a bunch of strategists, you can also put Gunblade for Misfortune to heal that front line. The last item I want to give a shout out to is Nash's Tooth. I think this item is actually quite superb on Misfortune, especially early if you want to ladder into Azir. So if you're not re-rolling Misfortune, let's say you're going for 3-star Misfortune, but then you realize that you want to go for 2-star instead, you can just play Nash's Tooth on her temporarily and put that onto Azir. And for people who don't know, since we're not covering this video, Nash's Tooth Azir is probably his best item. Support Misfortune is really good with the usual suspects, with like Shiv, for example, so you get a lot of AP. Give her Adaptive Helm so she's casting often so she can shred all those shields. And then Morel Namakan because she kind of hits an X, so it can hit a pretty big wide range of units. Misfortune also is really good with Deathfire Grasp, and she actually puts out so much damage she can burst past the tank really quickly. If you do want to include her as a potential sorcerer, she's another AP champion that can utilize it very well. But you often end up playing her in a Shurima comp because you want to get more strategists. So if you do have multiple of them, you can put one on your front line like a Jarvan or Sejuani, and then you can put another one on the back line like Misfortune. Nautilus is a pretty interesting utility tank. Most people look at his ability and the knockup within 2 hexes and stun, and rightfully so. It's actually very, very useful. 2 seconds at 1-star even can be very, very impactful. And so that's why Vow ends up being one of his best items, because he ends up casting and getting that extra mana so that he can get that quick CC. He also has bonus armor and MR, which ends up being even a further reason why Vow is his best item, so that way you can get those resistances when he drops below that threshold. But also really good if you want to solo frontline him, for example, with Stoneplate Gargoyle, or given things like Bramble Vest and Declaw. Unsurprisingly, Nautilus is also very good with a bunch of shred options because he's your tank, so you can give him things like Ionic Spark as well as the Even Shroud. And don't forget about things like Ages of the Legion, which gives that armor and MR to him, which he gets that bonus from, and the allies behind him as well. Nautilus works pretty well with the Ornn items that give him defensive stats like a Anima Visage, Eternal Winter, and Hull Crusher. And the other things I want to call out is Bastion Crest can end up being pretty good on Nautilus because Bastions give a bunch of resistances and Nautilus gets that bonus. One thing to know is that Nautilus doesn't end up being 3-starred pretty often, but if you end up wanting to play around Nautilus reroll with a bunch of other 3 costs, for example, you could go for it. But that's in contrast to Neeko, who actually is very good as a carry at 3-star. Neeko jumps in kind of like Jarvan. She just dives into the combat, but that ends up being really good because of her damage with Pop Blossom, and so that synergizes with Ionic Spark for that shred. She also utilizes the new item Crown Guard very well because she gets that max health HP shield, which synergizes with the resistances from Bastion, and when the shield expires, she gets more AP to deal damage. And because she's regularly shielding herself and taking a lot of sources of damage, Titan's Resolve ends up being a pretty solid item for her as well. Neeko also is a really good holder of these anti-heal items if you end up having her off tank, so you have her with Sunfire Cape, Morello, and you can give her Redemption because Redemption is just really good in those Bastion setups, as well as potentially replacement for things like Titans. And Neeko ends up being thrown to a ton of different compositions because Ixtal and Bastion are quite flexible traits depending on what the Ixtal is. And so you end up seeing her a lot in things like Demacia, Sorcerers, Invokers. You can give her those emblems and just watch her actually succeed as either secondary support or secondary tank. Quinn is the premier 3-cost AD champion, replacing Garen this set. And so she just wants a lot of flat AD items, no real attack speed necessary. You don't really need things like Rage Blade, for example. example. Deathblade, i.e. Guardbreaker, is the recommended items that I have right now, but you can also give her Last Whisper, which I put here in the support version. She's both good as a utility Last Whisper holder as well as carrying Last Whisper for herself. You can go like Deathblade, i.e. Last Whisper on her. She could also end up holding a bunch of support items. Like if you end up having her tucked away in the corner, you can give her things like the Zephyr or give her things like that Zeke's and have a bunch of row of Slayers. Quinn ends up being one of the best holders of Gold Collector, similar to Akshan, because she hits so many different units that it's possible for her to execute a bunch. Infinity Force is also quite a solid artifact on her because it just gives her so much stats. And then the emblem I see most often on Quinn is Challengers, because you end up playing like Demacia with Fiora, which we'll talk about later, and then have that vertical challenger with Quinn dealing a lot of damage. The thing about Quinn is that you do really want to play around either vertical Slayers or vertical Demacia. So if you end up playing like 3 Demacia, 2 Slayer and flexing a bunch of different things and trying to reroll Quinn for 3-star, you'll end up seeing her drop off quite considerably if you don't have a really good setup around it. One thing I noticed, Ryze is actually changing a lot of their Demacian items. They're not entirely sure what they want it to be guaranteed currently. So they've experimented with Ruden's Hurricane, for example. Right now, as I'm making this video, Quinn's Radiant item is Deathblade, which also might be too strong. And so remember that you probably want 2 items on Quinn only if you do end up pursuing around the Demacian version of her. 4 cost is the tier that's been replaced the most. We got 5 new champions heading into the mid set. Let's start things off with Fiora, one of my favorite 4 costs of all time from set 6 Gizmos and Gadgets. It's back. She was an Academy challenger back then. Here, she's Demacia challenger. Her Blade Waltz is basically like this anime-like Shunpo Shadow Step, blinking around and dealing damage and following her targets. And the best thing about it, if you look at the way the stat sheet is filled out, is she uses a little bit of everything. So she can use AD for the strikes, AP for the true damage, and heals so she keeps herself sustained in the fight. So Fiora's going to be a really strong champion to regularly play around and also a worthy replacement of Yasuo. So her itemization is actually extremely flexible. It's very likely that Fiora is the most flexible itemized champion. If you have like a bunch of generic items like Giant Slayer, Hand of Justice, Guardbreaker, you could always put that stuff on Fiora. Her best item is probably Steric's Gauge. We've talked about the value of Steric's Gauge on lower tier champions like the Rogues and the Slayers, and this is no different on Fiora. It's very, very powerful on her. And because she utilizes all different kinds of stats, Titan's Resolve gives you a little bit of everything like armor, MR, AD, AP. So Titan's Resolve ends up being a very good item on Fiora. Same rule applies to Fiora as it does Quinn. She's Demacia. So make sure you get that Radiant item on Fiora. So you go for 2 items. If you only go for 2 items on Fiora, I recommend Gauge as well as Titans, assuming that she has a source of healing. If she doesn't have a source of healing, you can go for like Hodge Titans or BT Titans. And I kind of laid out some of the other options here, which is showing things like Bloodthirster, which is really good if you have Titans since it synergizes with the items. You get that shield, which combos well with the resistances, both from the items as well as Demacia. Night Harvester is very likely good on Fiora because it just gives her all the stats that she wants with a little bit of everything, and it increases to 30, which is below HP, which you can heal back. Edge of Night is also really useful on her to keep her safe, especially if you end up getting things like Radiant Edge of Night. That's probably really good on her. Because Fiora uses every stat in the game, it's not a surprise that Thief's Gloves and Infinity Force are both very solid on her. And if you end up giving her a lot of stats with things like Noxus or potentially even one of my favorites, which is Shurima Fiora is also exceptionally good. Let's talk about Mordekaiser, who has one of the more unique itemizations in the game. Mordekaiser's best item is Quicksilver, which is similar to how Warwick is itemized. Mordekaiser just needs to not get stopped. So Quicksilver ends up giving him a lot of the stats that he wants. The most important stat for Mordekaiser is attack speed. And Quicksilver not only gives a lot of attack speed, but also the CC immunity. And because you can see that the God of Death basically steals a bunch of stats, gains a bunch of shields, and deals a bunch of damage, you want to give him things like RFC as well, which is now changed to give less bonus attack speed, but give you more bonus damage. And that bonus attack range ends up being really nice for Mordekaiser because he wants to swing God of Death and have as much uptime as possible. This also means that Mordekaiser is also really good with scoped weapons, which was an augment that wasn't very popular in 9.0, but might be better if you hit things like Mordekaiser. And then Nashor's Tooth ends up being really good on him for the same reasons as it's good on Azir, which is the more attack speed you get, the faster you're scaling Mordekaiser, and you can utilize that AP to deal big damage with his ability. Other items that are probably really good on Mordekaiser are Spark, because he ends up being within 1 to 2 range usually. Crown Guard, because you give him a bunch of HP and it gives that extra AP to scale his ability. And things like Edge of Night, so you can keep Mordekaiser a little bit safe. Probably a decent alternative to Quicksilver, so that way you don't get CC'd and Mordekaiser gets stopped. Zonia's Paradox is very good on Mordekaiser. It's basically the better version of Edge of Night, and it keeps Mordekaiser safe and untargetable. You can also play Mordekaiser in a Demacia setup because he is a Slayer, which ends up comboing well with both Kayle and Quinn. And then Challenger, Mordekaiser is also really good because the dude wants attack speed, so give him the attack speed. Also, Challengers dash to their next opponent, and Mordekaiser doesn't have to waste uptime waltzing around and figuring out where his next target is. So Nilah is similar to set 7 Dragonlands, where she kind of dashes around, but instead of actually like stealing shields, she just gains the shield herself, and she does a bunch of line AoE damage. You want to give her something like RFC, so that way her attacks strike very consistently and also deals a lot of that extra damage and gives her most stacking attack speed to scale her ability. Because she also gets into the action a lot, Stellaris Gauge is very good on her. And then Edge of Night ends up being really good to keep her safe, and you don't actually want her to draw aggro compared to Mordekaiser, so you want to give her Edge of Night. The reason why it's okay to give Quicksilver to Mordekaiser and it's less good on Nilah is because Mordekaiser can heal and sustain himself much more consistently than Nilah can, because Nilah has Vanquisher and Mordekaiser has Slayer. And because Mordekaiser is a Slayer, he can drain tank, meaning that he can absorb the damage that he's actually getting and heal it right back up. Nilah is less defensive in that sense, and she's more offensive through Vanquisher. Flat AD is always good on Nilah, but if you want to go for Quicksilver, it's an also decent alternative to Edge of Night. And then you can always give her things like Sunfire Cape because she's dashing around all the time and burning a bunch of different targets. Nilah can use a bunch of different stats as well, so Infinity Force is quite solid if you're playing things like Freaky Friday. She's also a really good holder of Blacksmith's Gloves because she utilizes a bunch of different stats and all those items pretty well. And the most common emblem you put on Nilah is Ionia, because Jhin and Xayah are Vanquishers and Ionians, so you can have her join the fray and play for 4 Vanquisher. Silco from Arcane is the new Zaun Sorcerer replacing Lux. His mana is only 50, so you want to give him blue buff. That is his best item by far. Silco is kind of the modern version of Renata from set 6, if you remember, where you want to play Renata with bruisers and have her basically try to attrition things down with Gunblade and Morello. Because he throws a bunch of things on the floor that creates shimmer, anything that gets damaged and burned by it ends up healing his units, which ends up doubling up with things like Gunblade. And so it's a lot of sustained damage for your front line. People don't know exactly if you want to play Silco in the traditional sorcerers. If you put Silco in like 6 Sorks where Lux was, you end up playing like 2 out of 3 Demacia, and you don't have that Zaun. So a lot of people are not entirely sure where Silco goes outside of potentially just splashing him in. Most common success I've seen for Silco is to play him in a Bastion Invoker line, where you just have him combo with Taric, and then you have Silco basically heal that Bastion frontline repeatedly with things like the blue buff and the Gunblade. You can also just put straight up AP and damage items on Silco. You don't have to give him as a support healer. You can give him things like the Death Cap, Guardbreaker, and Guardbreaker is really good because it hits a bunch of different targets. And Adaptive Helm is a good replacement for blue buff if you don't have any mana sources. Silco's best item is Mana Zane because he just throws out a bunch of different things that covers the entire field. So Mana Zane ends up being really, really strong on Silco in particular. If you have other artifacts, I would suggest putting Deathfire Grasp or Zonias on Silco as well. The last forecast I'll talk about is Xayah. Xayah is not actually similar to the version of set 7 Dragonlands where you wanted to put a bunch of attack speed and Rage Blade on her. The reason why is because Xayah is actually really powerful when she casts, and she gets a lot of cast through her Ionia bonus. And because her Ionia bonus restores an additional 5 mana, you actually want her to have 6 Ionia because her mana count is so high. Feather Strike costs 110 mana, and so even though you get 5 additional mana for her Ionia bonus, you actually still want to play her on 6 Ionia, I found, because it's very hard for her to get those Feather Strikes consistently proccing without having that vertical. Also interesting to know is that each feather removes 6 armor, so she kind of shreds for herself. You don't necessarily need Last Whisper on her, but it actually is pretty good if you want to get both of those things stacking, so you can put Last Whisper on her as well as the AD damage like the Deathblade and the Runins and the Guardbreaker. Runins is only really good if you have Deathblade though, so if you don't have Runins, for example, you can just go ahead and play Last Whisper, and this is a totally fine item set on her. Remember that you don't want Infinity Edge because Vanquishers give your ability the chance to crit, and so you don't really need Infinity Edge. This also applies to things like Jeweled Lotus. If you have Jeweled Lotus, you're probably not going to lean Vanquishers, but if you do, at least you get a little bit of extra crit strike chance, so it's not the worst thing in the world. Xayah also really utilizes generic items like Giant Slayer and Hodge perfectly fine. And remember, the more glove items you can put on her, the better, because Vanquisher gives you that crit chance, and so you want glove items to increase that chance to crit. Xayah is also really good with Gold Collector because she hits so many different units. Sniper's Focus because she's often in the corner and you want to amplify that damage and range. And also Trickster's Glass is my own theory. I actually believe it could be really strong, and I've seen it happen one time exactly, but it's still a work in progress. So if you want to go for it, give it a chance. And the best part about Trickster's Glass is not only do you get the ability to summon a second Xayah and you get that crit chance, but you also double shred that armor. So I've been told that it's pretty good. Give it a try yourself. If it doesn't work whatsoever, I'll go ahead and make a comment below and tell you guys not to do it. And here we go to the 5 cost. We start off with Gangplank. Gangplank can pretty much use any sort of items, but you want to lean towards AP. I think the best item for him is Adaptive Helm because it actually leans directly into the Reaver King trait. Because Reaver King changes where you position him in the front 2 rows or the back 2 rows, Adaptive Helm ends up being quite good on him, depending on what you need. And so if you put him in the back rows, you get that ability power and that mana so you can cast a lot with the pistol. Or if you need to put him in the front line, you can give him that bonus with things like the Adaptive Helm. Nashor's Tooth ends up being really good for Gangplank in particular if you put him in the back row. And don't forget that because the giant boat summons and hits everything, Guardbreaker is really good because he's going to damage a lot of shields with the Dreadway. Support Gangplank is also really good with things like Static Shiv and Morello because Shiv is really good for him to stay in the back and activate it with his ship. And then Morello, he hits the entire board, so Morello is a pretty good item on him if you want to use him for support. And if you put Gangplank in the front line, don't forget things like Crown Guard can be very good to give him that HP shield. And then when it expires, should be able to get that extra AP for that burst. Deathfire Grasp is Gangplank's best artifact item, but if you also want to put things like Blacksmith's Gloves because you get Capricious Forge, I highly recommend it because 2 Gangplanks is better than 1 if you get Trickster's Glass. You can also use a bunch of different items, and how you position him can completely change the effect of what Gangplank does. And then also Gangplank is really good with sorcerers. I've seen a sorcerer Gangplank completely destroy boards, so give it a try if you haven't already. There's 2 new Ryzes in set 9.5. Bilgewater Ryze basically is trying to farm you a bunch of treasure and it scales off your gold, and so you just want him to cast a lot. So I'd highly recommend things like Shojin and Nashor's Tooth to get Ryze rolling, especially if you play him in the Invoker line. He ends up farming you a ton. But my favorite is Ixtal Ryze. I think Ixtal Ryze is quite strong, and the thing about Ixtal Ryze is that he is a frontline tank. He's not actually a backline unit, and he scales off of the resistances you give him. So the more MR and armor you give him, the better impact he actually becomes. So give him things like Stoneplate Gargoyle and that Protector's Vow so he can cast very quickly and get those thick vines onto the field ASAP. I think Ixtal Ryze has a chance of being one of the top Ryzes in the game currently, unless they nerf him a lot in PvE. So there you have it, all of my recommendations for set 9.5's new champions. It's important to note that these are all work in progress, depending on what Riot does. We could have a completely different set of VIS if they choose to rework or change items and champions abilities completely. But if you discovered any tech or really powerful combos, let me know in the comments below, and I'll be sure to add that in a future video.